Ranjana, obviously you can tell from her name, she is of Indian origin and has very strong roots, family roots in Bihar, in Patna. In fact, she was in Patna yesterday visiting some relatives. But she was actually born in Australia, so she's an Australian citizen, which is where she lives now and practices medicine. And Ranjana is a medical oncologist who works in the public health system of Australia. Not in the private sector, but where really everybody goes for their care. And I think that's very instructive because that has shaped a lot of her thinking and what she does. She's focused a lot on doctor-patient communication. Her first book, which really became bestseller, Tell Me the Truth, right? I think you also have some of your books here with you, Ranjana. You can have. Her connection to University of Chicago actually is very deep. In 2004, she came as a Fulbright scholar and spent 1 year at the McLean Center for Medical Ethics. And Ranjana will tell you that that was very important in her career and her subsequent thinking. So she now actually comes regularly to Chicago. This last year, she taught an 8-week course, which was oversubscribed. And so, Ranjana, and the topic of her conversation is actually very interesting, which she'll tell you herself. Okay.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Dr. Kumar, to Dr. Singh, and also to Aditi and everyone else for having me here. It's I was just reflecting on the fact that I had never thought that I would be coming to India to deliver a talk. Although I was born in Australia, I grew up in Bihar, and I spent a lot of time and then subsequently went to Australia to study medicine. And as Dr. Kumar said, I not only have very strong roots in India, I also feel very strongly that the obligation of a doctor is to contribute, not just in one country, but hopefully around the world. And so in particular, this is such an honor and a privilege for me. So I kind of don't know why I'm here amongst these esteemed people who make my brain hurt. but I wanted to talk about medicine from a slightly different perspective, and it's sort of a potted journey of my career. Like many of you, I started medicine thinking that I would be a traditional doctor. I would see patients, I would be a clinician. And then somewhere along the line, I sort of became very interested in different things, as we will talk about. And I guess, I was asked here to talk about this whole sort of subject of what makes a good doctor. I don't know what makes a good doctor, but here are some thoughts on what I have seen good medicine to be like. And I'd be very interested to hear yours. So, everyone has this slide at the end of the talk, what you will learn. Well, I don't think you'll necessarily become a better doctor. You'll certainly not have learned any new skills from me. But you will have seen a very atypical journey. And you'll be free to dream up your own, hopefully. This is a picture of Melbourne. This is the MCG, the Australian Tennis Open. So if you're ever there, Sydney Opera House, sort of famous views of Australia. I grew up in the bubble of first world medicine. So I studied medicine in Australia in a top class. Australia has one of the most wonderful, publicly supported healthcare systems in the world. It's the envy of the world, and for good reason. And I found myself growing up in that bubble, but also not forgetting what I had seen in India and in Bihar when I was growing up. So when I was about to finish my training as a clinician, I came and volunteered with the Missionaries of Charity. I took 6 months off work, sort of like a gap year, and I thought, well, I'll go and see how other people do medicine. And I guess, it was quite an escape from the bubble of first world medicine, because what I found working in many street side clinics, this is a picture of the hospice in Calcutta, is that there wasn't a great deal of medicine that one could really practice. I mean, there weren't drugs to give out. There weren't, it was my stethoscope and I, sort of. The drugs were often poor, expired. There wasn't the infrastructure. And so here I was, coming from Western medicine, where at the drop of a hat you could summon an entire team of people to resuscitate a patient. And I thought, what am I doing here? And how do I become an effective doctor in a place like this where I feel naked? I feel without support. And I realized slowly as I became more used to it that what I was seeing was a kind of medicine that relied a lot on compassion, and it relied on the human touch. And there were people in the hospice, and sometimes the doctor in me, the clinician, the heart clinician in me would say, oh my God, this person needs, they need morphine, and he needs, super strong antibiotics, and gosh, if I was in Melbourne, I'd be using this antiseptic and this wound dressing. And there was none of it. And then I saw all the other volunteers, and there were some doctors and nurses, but also other volunteers, and I saw how they spoke with people. And I saw how healing, just the feeling of being with somebody, of holding their hand, of sort of brushing their hair, of massaging their feet, almost because there was nothing else you could do for these people. And I found that incredibly striking, and it was a transformative journey outside of first world medicine to say, and these people thanked you, and they felt better. And I thought, how can they possibly feel better when you haven't healed them? And it makes you realize that there's more than one way of healing, and drugs and prescriptions are certainly very important, but medicine cannot be contained to that. So that was my first experience, and I came back to the Missionaries of Charity a few years later to do the same work again, because it really did inspire me. In Melbourne, I went back, and this was as I was finishing up it was just at the start of my oncology training. So I went back from the Missionaries of Charity, and I wanted to become an oncologist. And I started working, volunteering an afternoon a day at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, which is Australia's largest resource centre for refugees and asylum seekers. Many of you may not be familiar with Australian policy, which has been derided around the world, but Australia has an extremely harsh policy against refugees and asylum seekers, who are essentially not allowed to enter the country, and they are detained on an island, which is very hot, which doesn't have great conditions, and it's an ongoing, very, very vitriolic political debate, really, about what Australia should do about refugees and asylum seekers. And I can't even remember how I ended up working at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, but again, this place wasn't as far as India. This place was 10 minutes away from one of the top hospitals in Melbourne where I was training. And I would go along to this place in the afternoon, and I would be not a fancy oncology trainee, but like a general practitioner. And I would treat dandruff and asthma and hypertension. And these were people, once again, who had fled from around the world, who were professionals, who were people like me one day. And now they were bereft of everything. They were living in the community, dependent on charity. And it was really quite striking to me that, and there were a couple of incidents in particular that really touched me that I wrote about in the book. And one of them was a woman had breast cancer, and she was on a very cheap drug called tamoxifen, and she had run out of her tamoxifen. And I managed to get some at cost price from a pharmacist. And the pharmacist said to me while she was sending the tamoxifen, she said, "What's a young doctor like you doing helping refugees? You're going to ruin your career." And I thought, wow, I'd never thought of that. It never struck me. And I kept thinking to myself, how is it that 10 minutes, at a 10-minute drive, I have this world-class hospital where I'm spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every day on my patients without anyone looking over my shoulder, because I'm a registrar by that time, right? So I'm prescribing chemotherapy, I'm doing whatever needs to be done, and no one says to me, why are you doing this? Why are you spending money? Or, where is the accountability as such? And I come to this refugee center, and I can't get salbutamol. I can't renew someone's antihypertensive script. So again, it came back to, how does one practice medicine when one is deprived of the tools of medicine? And again, I realized that a lot of the care at the Asylum Seeker Center was about listening to people, about validating their grief, about validating their illnesses. And a lot of illnesses were in the mind, of course, because all these refugees and asylum seekers, have a lot to grieve. So simply listening to people was therapy. And again, I realized, unfortunately, that when you don't have the tools of medicine, there are other ways in which you must learn how to help people. So I kind of think I did very little medicine at the Asylum Seeker Center because there wasn't medicine to practice, but I listened a lot, I saw a lot, I sympathized a lot. And I spent a good couple of years working for them. I have now stopped working there, but I support them through my public speaking and my book sales, etc. But it was once again a sort of a very large experience in my life that governs my thinking to this day. Somehow, somewhere along the line, I started to write. Well, that's probably not true. I started writing when I was very young. I started writing a journal when I was about 10 years old, and I continue to write to this day. And so I have a bookshelf that's filled with journals from since I was 10. And as I was saying to someone this morning, then I entered medicine, and I thought, wow, medicine is full of stories. You stumble over stories in medicine, and I continued to write. And a lot of my writing, my first piece of writing for the New England Journal, for example, was about working at the Asylum Seeker Center, about refugees and what the world and what doctors like us working in first world conditions owe to refugees and asylum seekers. And so that was my first piece of sort of globally published, I suppose, piece several years ago now, almost 10 years ago. I think, and we will discuss this today, but I think medicine is very hierarchical and very conservative in how it defines success. And I ran into this very early in life where someone had said to me, what are you doing wasting time with refugees? What are you doing going to India when you should be becoming a super duper oncologist, doing something, discovering a drug, really curing someone? And I think we fail people who don't subscribe to those views as strongly as clinicians. And especially when you work in a tertiary center, when you work at a large academic center, there's a very set sort of skills that you are set piece of skills. And people think you will do your training, you will go on to do a PhD, you will go on to do some research. That's what we reward in medicine. And here I was discovering that there was a whole other world of medicine that was really gratifying. It seemed to be helping patients, but I felt always that I was failing. I was failing the people who had employed me. I was failing the people who thought that, I was built of better stuff and I should be out there doing some, startling piece of research and changing the world through discovering a cure for cancer maybe. And I thought, well, I'm just not that person. I don't think I'm particularly interested in that. Although I have great respect for people who do, because through them, I become a better clinician. So it took me a long time to realize that there were many paths in medicine, and that sometimes, the twisted path was also the path worth taking and the path less taken. And so that was kind of where I began my journey, saying, well, I've pretty much identified that I'm not going to do certain things, but it doesn't lessen my love for medicine or for patients. And I guess, now we talk about the doctor-patient relationship, but 15 years ago, that just wasn't a term in vogue. So what did that mean? Didn't everyone have a doctor-patient relationship? And, communication, that wasn't something you could possibly specialize in or claim any dominance over, because all doctors were supposed to be good communicators. That's how we chose doctors, right? So, so there was no concept that you could potentially work your way, spend your career doing stuff like this. And it's only now that I have a name to what I've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. Chicago, as Dr. Kumar said, was a particularly transformative experience in my life. And again, it was the path less taken. So I applied for a Fulbright scholarship at a time when my colleagues were sort of following the more traditional path of becoming an oncologist or going into research or setting up a private practice. And I will never forget, I went to Chicago. I spent a year doing a Fulbright year. It was such a great year in my life. I learned a lot of things. I met some amazing people who I'm very connected to. And I came back, and the head of one of the hospitals said to me, a Fulbright in ethics. What on earth would we do with that? And I thought, it's really difficult to convince people that there are different ways of doing medicine. And someone said, if only we had use for something like this. And this is a very highly developed system of medicine, but it's instructive to see how people think. It's not just in India, it's not just in France, people all over. I mean, I think, and we have to combat that sense of medicine that there's only one way of becoming a doctor. So here I was, an outlier again. I'm an oncologist, I have a Fulbright in ethics, and I'm back to my hospital sort of doing medicine. And I thought, well, oncology is full of stories, and I'm going to write those stories. And you can't underestimate the value of meeting people who are diverse and whose ideas are diverse. In fact, I was just saying to some people that I was reading a piece in the New York Times, and everyone must be familiar with all the college rankings that come out every year. And there was another ranking on the diversity of ideas, and the University of Chicago topped that list. And I looked at it and I thought, I'm completely unsurprised, because it was the first place where I felt I could take a breath, and people said to me, if you want to write, you should write. And someone for the first time in all those years said to me, you've got a book in you. And so I came back after a year in Chicago thinking, if the people at the University of Chicago think there's a book in me, then there must be a book in me. And I wrote. So my first book was Tell Me the Truth, which is actually available here, although I'm not flogging my book by any means. So Tell Me the Truth is really, there are accounts of patients about what it's like to be on the other side of the desk, being an oncologist, and different stories of patients, everything from people choosing not to have treatment, to dealing with a lot of end-of-life stuff, to dealing with my personal experiences, dealing with very sick patients, patients who are dying as I am pregnant, and people who are my age, who I'm looking after, who are dying. And so, a lot of stories, and I was fortunate enough, sort of out of the blue, it was shortlisted for a major literary prize, which I didn't win. The Prime Minister, the ex-Prime Minister of Australia, won that prize, so I thought I had lost. I was in good company at least. But what writing that book did for me is it gave me a lot of courage and sort of consolation that there were other things to do in medicine apart from seeing patients, and that writing was, I didn't need to validate it, but it was nice to be validated. I wrote a second book called Dying for a Chat a year later, which was based on an incident that I had with a 90-year-old patient who I was looking after as a general physician, who essentially crisscrossed the labyrinthine system of a medical sort of hospitalization, and in the end she died. But she died after living a complete mess of a life, which is what happens in modern medicine, where we don't allow people to die well. And so she went through, every procedure and every tube and every intervention, when we all should have known that she was going to die, and had we only established the goals of care and had only stepped back from our individual subspecialties and thought, how can we look after this patient rather than how can we look after the kidneys, and then how can we address her lungs, we would have done better. So this book was really written as a mea culpa to say, we need to be better communicators. Doctor-patient communication is important. It's not just an optional extra. This is something that actually matters every day to every patient. So this book happened to win the Human Rights Literature Prize, which is really interesting, because I would never have thought, I would never have dreamt that doctor-patient communication would be treated as a human right, especially at the end of life. So this award was actually very meaningful to me, because it elevated doctor-patient communication, especially at the end of life, to saying, hang on, this is a basic human right, that patients should be treated better, and that just as we live well, or we aspire to live well, we should also aspire to die well. So that was quite nice. And I'll never forget, I stepped up to receive the prize. And of course, no one had read the book and no one knew what it was about. And so I spent my speech telling people that I know you won't read the book, but here is what it's about. So then I wrote a couple of other books, and it's A Cancer Companion is also available in India under a different title. And that's a book. So gradually, I guess I put up pictures of this book, not so much to tell you that I've written some books, but between those two books, Tell Me the Truth was about how I feel, how medicine makes me feel. Dying for a Chat was kind of stepping into advocacy a little bit and saying, we are not as good as we think we are. We need to do better. And then slowly, and as the years went by and I began to reflect on the different ways of being a doctor, A Cancer Companion was really a tool for patients. It's a guide for patients who have been diagnosed with cancer from the very start to, when you've just found out a diagnosis, and it takes them all the way through hopefully survivorship, but also end of life. And it was quite an interesting experience writing a book like this, because I think in order to offer advice to patients, that of course your colleagues are also going to read, you have to confront the fact that you will lay bare for patients the things that don't work in medicine, because you're empowering the patient. And you can't empower the patient without telling them all the things that we don't do as well as we should. So in a way, it was a big step for me to become an advocate for patients by writing books like this, and the second book, which was about survivorship in particular, to say, I feel good enough to be able to, I feel strong enough to be able to be an advocate, to be an effective advocate for patients, but also look upon ourselves and say, these are the things we could do better. And I think it's a very different thing to writing about how something makes you feel, because you can be forgiven for writing something that you have just felt, but it's quite different to be offering advice to people based on your experiences and the fact that some of your experiences are critical of the system that you work in. My first foray into sort of public media was with a newspaper called The Age. So it's a prominent newspaper in Australia. It was very funny. It was just around Christmas time, and the editor of The Age called me, or the editor of this magazine. It's a beautiful, glossy magazine, the Melbourne magazine, which has now gone defunct because it cost too much money to produce. And a few days before Christmas, he called me and said, I'll be upfront with you. I haven't read your book. This is Tell Me the Truth. I haven't read your book, but my wife has read your book, and she thinks we should get you to write for us. So it shows the power of the wife in a relationship. So he said, so I'm calling to offer you a job. And so he offered me a column, and this was a monthly column. And so here I was. I had always been writing for doctors in the New England Journal or in JAMA or in the Lancet, and doctors are a very different population to talk to. And so here I was writing for the public, and it took quite a bit of getting used to. My books, I had only published one book at that time, Tell Me the Truth, and I thought, how does one honor an obligation to the public? What do I talk about that somebody who has paid money to buy this magazine will learn from it? And it began to change my thinking to say, well, if someone is spending time reading my column, then it can't just be about I felt sad, or I felt angry, or I had a bad day at work, or whatever, or something was emotional. What will someone take away from it? And so I began to think about experiences which are common to other patients. So for example, one of the first columns I wrote was about how an oncologist never says to a patient, you are cured, period. There will always be a but. There is always, we need to see, as far as we can tell. There is always some kind of a prefix or a suffix to you are well, but. So I wrote about the fact that, why is it? Because often patients will say, it's been 5 years to my cancer, and the oncologist can't get these words out of their mouth that, you are well, you are cured, and that's all I want to hear. And so I wrote a column explaining about recurrence and about, partly genetics, but partly the fact that if you have one cancer, you are more prone to getting another cancer. Breast cancer is a good example where we see cancer that has returned after 20 years. And so you can actually not say to a lot of people, you're fine, your cancer is cured, that's great. So columns like that, and there were many other columns that I wrote for 2 years, sort of explaining to patients my perspective of medicine, but giving them a window into medicine to say, well, how does this help me when I'm reading it? For 10 years, I was very proud to write for The Week, so the Indian edition of The Week. Again, they called me out of the blue and asked if I would write for them, and I wrote a a column every couple of months, which was wonderful. And between the age and the week, I got my first taste of public feedback. And I tell you, as a clinician, and as a clinician who is actually working in a health system, one of my greatest fears was that people would write to me and ask me for advice and ask me for second opinions, which is the bane of every doctor's life, right? I mean, you can't offer opinions about what the other oncologist is treating your cancer with in an email. And I thought, I'm going to be flooded. So for a while, I thought, do I even publish my email? I set up a separate email account. And I tell you, I was absolutely floored by how flawed I was in my thinking. I received dozens and dozens of emails every week, maybe even more. And it would be the rare person who writes to say, what do you think of my treatment? But people from all around the world write to say how the story made them feel. They want to share their experiences. I have a stack of handwritten letters from 80-year-olds, spidery writing, 3 pages of paper. It's so touching to say, I read your story and I want you to know what happened to me, what happened to my wife, and so on. And I guess all these stories really showed me then the power of reaching out to people and the power of communication. And slowly I began to see, I'd never quite imagined it like this, but I kind of began to see that it was a form of service to the community. It was a service that I'd never thought I would be doing. I wanted to be a traditional doctor just like everyone else. But when people said, you will never see me and I will never see you, but I just wanted you to know how much better that story made me feel, or how well something was explained, and I finally realized why my doctor did X, Y, Z. It was really nice. It was really empowering for me. And then with that, a gradual realization that this was a responsibility. This wasn't going to be a lark. So then The Guardian came to town. So The Guardian, as many of you will know, used to be the Manchester US and in Australia. There is no secret to it. I kept banging on their door till I got in. Perseverance, just like everywhere else. So, every 6 weeks, I would write to them and say, will you let me write for you? And they would say, we're too busy. And, medicine, writing about medical matters is not the first thing on our agenda. We want to set our feet and we want to talk about politics and cultural affairs, whatever. Medicine is lower. Medicine and ethics, oh my God, that's even lower on the list. And then I started writing a couple of pieces here and there when I picked up something in the news. All newspapers are driven by what's in the news and how can I hook something to the news. So they're not particularly interested in long, short things or visions. They want something from the news that is current and then an opinion. So I've always been a very avid newsreader, so I would say, hey, look, this is something about how common depression is in doctors. Do you want me to write a column about this? And so they began to say yes a few times. And then one day, a couple of years later, I get this phone call, and the phone call says, there was no trumpet, there was no band, and it says, can you send us a picture? And I said, sure, what do you want a picture for? And they said, well, we should have the pictures of our regular columnists on the newspaper. And so I'm putting 2 and 2 together, and I said, oh, so am I a regular columnist? And they said, oh, well, yes. I said, oh, well, thank you. So that was how I found out that they were planning on featuring me as a regular columnist, which I've now been for the last few years. And I wanted to talk to you about some of the things that I've written about, which have kind of, in a way, they have, it informs you of the journey that I have made in using this column and using this platform as a platform of responsibility to educate patients. So this was 2015, I think. I was at ASCO, which is the major cancer conference held in Chicago each year. And there were a couple of, every year at ASCO, there are these announcements of blockbuster drugs. And there was a lot of hue and cry that year about a melanoma drug, about a couple of melanoma drugs. And someone else had written in The Guardian about how these two melanoma drugs would absolutely transform the lives of melanoma patients. And, usual epithets that are used with cancer drugs, miracles, breakthroughs. And so The Guardian calls me in Chicago and says there's been a huge backlash against this column because other people are saying it's not true and it's all hyperbole and we need a more balanced piece. So can you please write another piece? And they were so desperate, they wanted me to scribble something on paper and fax it to them. I said, I'm in Chicago, I'm in a hotel, I don't have my computer. They said, just write something and send it. So anyway, so I wrote this piece about why I won't be rushing to tell my cancer patients there's a cure. And what the column says is, yes, there are all these developments, and yes, melanoma patients are much better off today than they used to be, but by no means is this a miracle. By no means is this a breakthrough or a cure for cancer. And it's really important when talking about cancer to use measured language. And so this is one example of using a public platform for public good and from saying, no, hang on, let's step back and let's just consider this more calmly. So, The Guardian was particularly sort of relieved by this piece, but this is the kind of piece I always write, trying not to be polarizing, trying not to take sort of extreme views of anything, but kind of going, what's sensible, what's reasonable, what can you take away from this, reader, if you're spending time reading a column? This was supposedly, so if you look at, if you look at the shares, it's 41,000, and I think it went up to something like 100,000. The Guardian, by the way, and all newspapers these days can tell you exactly how many people have clicked on a piece. They can tell you how many seconds people have spent on your column. So initially when they came to me, they said, we want you to write a 500-word column because people don't read beyond that. And I said, I can't write a 500-word column and do justice to the kind of things I want to speak about because I don't want to write sound bites. If you want a sound bite, there are many other people you can ask. But if you want a column that's measured, that's actually saying something that's useful and informative and that I can take seriously and you can take seriously, it'll have to be 1,000, 1,200 words, which is a reasonable length. So they relented. They said, okay, if that's what you want. But this is a picture of a girl who died after taking extreme alternative therapies for her cancer, after she had exhausted some other conventional treatments and also then decided to not have other conventional treatments. And so someone said to me, when people take these extreme therapies or homeopathy, etc., and they die, what do? Do you call the provider? Do you talk to them? Do you say, how could this happen? And I thought, no, we never do. We don't talk to them because we've given up on them a long time ago. And sometimes there's no one to call because it's all internet-based medicine. And so, what do doctors say to alternative therapists when a patient dies? Nothing. We never talk. And this column apparently was the single most shared opinionated piece in The Guardian for 3 whole days, 3 consecutive days around the world, which is a big thing for The Guardian. It doesn't really mean that much to me. But I think the issue was not because I wrote it, but because it touched a chord. And that's why I think, once again, if you pick subjects that are interesting and relevant to people, you can actually educate people through it rather than just being a rant about alternative medicine. And so, if you read on to this column, it talks about the fact that part of the reason that we oncologists in particular lose patients to alternative care providers is because people don't feel understood by us. They don't feel listened to. Goes back to doctor-patient communication. When people feel that they can't have rapport with you, they just can't connect with you, they go to an alternative provider. What does the alternative provider do? They talk to people. They listen to patients. Medicine is a very small part of how we heal patients. And I speak to hundreds and hundreds of people who go to alternative healthcare providers. I'm fascinated. And they all say, that person listens to me. They care for me. It goes to show that if you sit and listen to people, they think that you care. This was a fairly personal column that I wrote So in 2005, when I was coming back from my Fulbright year, I was pregnant with twins in Chicago. It was a year where 2 of the fellows were pregnant with twins. It was a wonderful year. And I got back to Melbourne, and I was about sort of 20 weeks or so healthy. I had all my antenatal checks in Chicago, and I got to Melbourne. And on the very first ultrasound that I had before I was going to meet the obstetrician, my new obstetrician, I was told that the twins were dying. And they were dying of this syndrome that I had never heard of, twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome. I can't even remember ever having read about it in peds or obstetrics, etc. And so within a matter of days, that they had both died. And it was quite a personal decision, you know, and every writer traverses this line about how much to write about oneself. And the question comes back to, why are you doing it? So in this instance, I wrote about the fact that that experience of, and you know, no matter where we are as doctors, we are all going to be patients one day. We are all destined to be patients. I just became a patient much earlier than I had thought. And so I wrote about the fact that what I remembered about that experience, apart from the tragedy of it, of course, is that my obstetrician cried. He had just done the ultrasound. He knew far better than me that they were both going to die, and he took me into his room, and he drew this picture of arteries and veins in blue and red, and he drew a picture of these twins, and he had tears flowing down his cheeks. This is a man in his 50s. And I looked at him and I thought, and all of a sudden, my grief seemed divided. My grief was halved. I thought, there is someone else who actually cares about this. My husband wasn't there because it was a routine ultrasound. He was looking for a job. We had literally just landed in Melbourne. I was there by myself. And I think he really felt, my obstetrician really just felt the pathos of that whole scenario, where a young woman who is perfectly well otherwise, who has supposedly had great and perfect antenatal health, has come in for something so routine and is going home a changed person. And I thought that it was the most amazing gesture on his part, and I've never ever forgotten. I can still picture it. Sitting in his crowded room, cramped room, because you know obstetricians, the ones who do ultrasounds during the day, don't really have room to see patients anywhere. And he's clearing up his chair for me, and he's offering me the more comfortable chair because I'm heavily pregnant. And so I decided to write about it 10 years after the event. And again, I wrote because I wanted to highlight the importance of doctor-patient communication and that relationship that is forged when somebody is sick and how therapeutic it can be. My favorite anecdote about this column is that obviously it sort of went around the world because people are always interested in this kind of stuff, but it was also featured in the North Korean news. And I kept thinking to myself of, you know, Kim Jong-il, the dictator, crying tears over his cornflakes, reading the morning paper about, you know, some woman who has lost her twins. I thought that was just priceless. Other columns I've written that have particularly touched a chord. So this one was called A Letter to My Patient Whose Terminal Cancer is the Least of Her Worries. And I told you about my long association with asylum seekers and refugees. So this was about a refugee patient diagnosed with metastatic pancreatic cancer, which has a uniformly poor prognosis. And she used to tell me, you know, death and dying is sort of part of my life, my greatest worry. And I used to be fed up because, or I didn't used to be so fed up as everyone else around me as well. She didn't show up for her appointments in time. She wouldn't show up for chemotherapy. When you talked to her, her answers were sort of neither here nor there. And I used to think to myself, I'm trying to help you. Why won't you let me help you? And then one day she, you know, we found out, or she told me that her biggest issue was that she didn't have anywhere to leave her 2-year-old and her 4-year-old when she came for chemotherapy. And she said, that's my biggest issue. It's not the fact that I'm dying of cancer. And so I thought again, you know, and Australia has such a polarized climate when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. And I thought here is a human insight into the people that we just know through newspapers and through our biases, and we nobody has actually met a refugee. No one actually meets these asylum seekers because they don't live where we live. They live in poorer areas, or they live in unsupported. Most doctors wouldn't treat refugees and asylum seekers. And I thought, what is it that I can learn from this experience for myself? But if I'm writing a column, is this suitable for a column? And again, the number of people who wrote to me, it was so moving. Firstly, people who said, I never knew, which I knew would happen. Secondly, people who said, how can I help this family? Can I babysit? And of course, there was patient privacy and all of the rest. And so I had to write numerous emails saying, thank you so much for your offer, but I can't tell you where she lives, and I can't tell you who her kids are. But again, sort of bringing humanity together in such a powerful way. And people saying, I haven't been able to sleep all night because I cannot imagine the plight of this woman. So again, I thought that was a good example of using a public platform to inform people and to say, open your eyes just a little bit wider and look at the world beyond the perspectives that you have. I've written a few pieces now on detention of asylum seeker children and refugees. They are sort of kept behind bars in the community. It's been an issue of huge debate in Australia. And here is a screenshot of some of the other stuff that I've written about. So one of them was about medical hierarchy and surgeons' egos. There must be a few surgeons in this room. So, about medical hierarchy and how we put surgeons at the top of that list, and on it goes, and why we do that, and the corrosive effect it has on junior doctors and medical students and all of us. I wrote a recent piece about racism in medicine, when a patient screamed out aloud at a Chinese doctor that she didn't see Chinese doctors. I mean, the irony is that Australia is extremely multicultural, and about a quarter of Australians have got at least one parent who was born overseas. So it's a highly multicultural society, and you just can't, there are days on which if you don't want to see an Indian doctor or a Chinese doctor, then you're out of luck. So it just, you can't have that. So I wrote a piece about racism. Again, it brought out a lot of comments from people, from doctors, from nurses who said, I face this all the time. Thank you so very much for highlighting it. So the column is, I hope it makes for interesting reading, but what I love about writing for The Guardian is reading the comments that follow, because the comments come from all around the world. Since the column is syndicated in the US and in the UK and in Australia, and then it also makes its way to India, for example, and other places, the comments really reflect a wide cross-section of the global society, so it's very meaningful. A few years ago, I actually went on radio I was invited to talk about one of my books. When you publish a book, people have an author on the show. This is one of Melbourne's sort of very well-established, kind of like a hero of Melbourne journalism, radio journalism. His name is John Fain, and he's a lawyer who is now working in public broadcasting. So he practiced law for a long time, and then he's now a radio journalist, a radio broadcaster, but not a shock jock, a really sort of very measured, thoughtful, extremely intelligent, witty journalist. And it's interesting, and so I got invited back onto his show to be one of his co-hosts, because every day he has an hour after the news bit is over of a in-depth conversation with two invited guests, and he has a co-host, and it's a different co-host every day. And often the co-host is someone who might have a book to pitch, or they've made a CD or something like that, but I have kept going back, although I haven't had any books to pitch, and I don't like pitching my books on radio. But what I enjoy about being a co-host on this show, it's called the Conversation Hour, and any of you who are interested can download the podcast. It's 774 ABC is the name of the radio station. What I really enjoyed about being a co-host again is that in that hour, the first 10 minutes are spent with the co-host talking to John about anything. So it's usually, if you have brought out a new CD, you might talk about your CD and how you made your CD. If you've written a book, you might talk about your book. If you have a show. But I have deliberately used those 10 minutes to talk about something of public health importance. So it may be something that has just happened. It may be, I don't know, something like air pollution because a coal mine has, been causing air pollution, or it might be something about end of life, which is something I see a lot of. But we spend those 5-10 minutes or so talking about making medicine better, making healthcare better. And again, this show has a huge audience, both live as well as on podcast. So it's a wonderful opportunity for me to get in something that I've been thinking about, how do I inform the public of this? How do I get people to know that something like this is, important? It may be about making a will. It may be about advanced care directives. But it's wonderful to have that slot. And one of the other reasons I put up this picture is because often in medicine, when we talk about mentors, we think that the mentor should be someone who does what we do, because only then can they guide us and advise us. And I can say that John Fain has become one of my mentors because of his character and because of what he does and what he embodies, not so much that he's any expert in medicine. I'm the expert in medicine there, but it doesn't matter. Different people can become your guides and your mentors and can help you in different ways. So what he has really helped me with is perhaps how to shape a message to the media. So when I sit with him, I learn about how he talks. And I also learn about how he interviews patients. Because, it's no mean feat to interview people every day for an hour to a live audience and to have interest. And, with John, I've interviewed people who are ballerinas. I've never been to a ballet show in my life that I can remember. How do you produce interest in what a ballerina does? Someone who works on the ships. I've never met a ship worker in my life. The ship worker wrote a book. He was a guy who belonged to a trade union. So he wrote a book about trade union secrets. I've got nothing to do with trade unions. But what this show has taught me is how to not feign interest in people, but how to actually create interest in people. I'll quickly go through some other slides before I take questions. So these are just some examples of people we have interviewed. So one of them over there. So these are two people who run a phone line called Grief Line. And Grief Line is a 24 hours a day call line that basically takes phone calls from grieving people. And I wanted to talk about grief because I think grief is something we don't talk about very much, especially in Western society. So we called these two people in, and we took talk back for the whole hour from patients, from people, talking about grief. This is someone famous, Will Smith, who's a famous writer. So lots of writers and authors come through, and the interesting part about this conversation is, so this is Sarai Walker, who is a woman who is an American woman who wrote a book about being fat. She calls herself as sort of very fat and wrote a book about being fat. And he, who was chain smoking in the studio with his electronic cigarette, took her to pieces on live radio about being overweight, and about how it was her fault. And I'm sitting there as the co-host going, this is unacceptable behavior. What do I do about it? This is live radio. I'm not the host of this show, but I'm really embarrassed. And so I backed her up, and I told him that what he was saying was not true, and that, and then the host followed suit by saying, and here you are chain smoking your cigarettes. And so, the balance was evened out again. So it was very, very interesting. These are this was a guy who was a carer for his father who had cancer, who now works as a volunteer in that area. This was a young man who had cancer, who was the son of doctors, who wrote a book about having cancer. And we interviewed them about their experiences of cancer. So on and on. I mean, you get a diverse audience, and I learn a lot from this, and hopefully am able to instill health messages wherever appropriate. Some of you might recognize this man who is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a famous star astronomer, who runs a large museum in the States. So he was out in Australia, and this was a television program which is normally reserved for live TV, which is normally reserved for political and current affairs. But on that night, they got together 4 people, a mathematician, a geoscientist, an astronomer, and me, to talk about the sciences. And again, it was a wonderful opportunity to talk about the things that matter in medicine, and in particular about doctor-patient communication, which is what I did. This is a recent thing that I did on television about stress and cancer, so a show about stress and cancer. The reason I put this up is sort of instructive to anyone who wants to work in the media. So the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, came to me with this idea. I was very interested in doing some television and seeing what it would be like. And it was a program on how stress causes an increased rate of metastases when you have cancer. Now, stress and cancer are they go together in the public imagination when it comes to chronic illness. And my first thought was that as a doctor, the last thing I want to do is to tell people that stress causes cancer, because that's what people hear. And I keep thinking at the forefront of my mind, whenever I write something, whenever I say something, or whenever I'm on a program, is how will I go back to clinic tomorrow, and will I be able to hold up my head when I do so? So I said to these producers, I said, at the very outset of this show, you have to say that this research is in mice, not in humans. And they said, okay, we will do that. And then slowly I began saying, and you need to make it very clear that we are not saying stress causes cancer. This is an existing cancer. This is hypothetical. This requires a lot of human backing up. And so one of the producers said, half jokingly to me, but Ranjana, that will just kill our story. And I said, well, then the story will be killed. But you cannot have me. And it goes back to you owning the space, because what you say these days, especially the digital footprint, is forever. And so I think all of us have to be very careful in what we say, because those words can come back to us. And I didn't want to go back to clinic the next morning and have someone say, well, I'm stressed, and everyone is stressed, and now I know that stress causes cancer because you said so on television. Very quickly, so part of sort of empowering people and advocating for people, this is Kate Richards, who used to be a medical student classmate of mine. And Kate then developed very, very severe psychotic depression. And by her reckoning, sort of went mad. And she wrote a brilliant book. It's one of the best books I have read, which is called Madness, a Memoir. And Kate had to leave clinical medicine and now works in sort of paramedical sort of research roles. She was very, very unwell for a very long time. And she wrote this blistering book about how poorly the medical profession treated her, even though she was one of us. And she talks about being imprisoned in the psychiatric system. And if you think we do medical health well, I think it's well and truly proven we do mental health shockingly. And so she wrote this book. And so I interviewed her, having learned some skills from radio, I interviewed her about her experience of the mental health system, about being a doctor and a patient, and being somebody who can articulate that. So another way I thought that, I could use the skills that I have gained to do this. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip through a number of slides. Lots of people at this point ask me about writing, and I'm very happy to answer lots of questions about writing. But the creative process is essentially a lot of perseverance and a lot of time spent writing. And all this stuff about sort of inspiration and finding a quiet space somewhere by the sea where there are no children and no emails and no computers, it doesn't happen. And so, if you want to write, you write where you are, which is what I've learned. So, what have I learned from my career so far? I really do think that all of medicine boils down to the doctor-patient relationship. It is absolutely key. And that's why good communication deserves our concern and it deserves our attention. I've finally come to realize after sort of 10, 15 years of writing, more than that, that writing and media are not just an okay thing to do. They're not sort of taking a break from real medicine, but they're a key aspect of being a doctor. It's not for everyone, just like being a clinician isn't for everyone, just like doing research isn't for everyone, but interacting with the media and writing for the public is a really core aspect of being doctors, because after all, we are doctors for our patients. And part of the role that we should all play is prevent people from becoming our patients by empowering them beforehand. And this is a favorite African proverb of mine that I like to put up at the end of my show, because I often felt very small, sort of writing and not doing more important things in life. But I think it's been a career that's been worthwhile. So thank you for listening.